And I just want to open up for the first question because it's been 6 years since you both last participated in the Day of Remembrance. And so, how much, in your opinion, has changed and how much has stayed the same? So, either one of you.
I think I'll let Mariko go first, since that was the day I became Mariko's dad instead of Dr. Rooks.
Well, I mean, I think we can't really disregard the elephant in the room, which is obviously the current pandemic. And obviously that has changed a lot. But I think in terms of how the environment today, both the pandemic and everything that happened this summer, has impacted the ways in which, life has changed. And the topics that we talked about at that Day of Remembrance, which were, looking at the legacy of Executive Order 9066 and Black Lives Matter, and how can we put those two things in conversation? I think one of the biggest things that's changed between now and then has been this sort of national coverage and national and international dialogue about Black Lives Matter in a way that I think was surprising to both of us, because I was at home this summer, in terms of how many people were sitting and listening and actually willing to really deeply self-interrogate their own positionality, right? Where do I stand in this? How am I being complicit in anti-Blackness, and what can I do to fix this at a personal level, at an institutional level? And it's always still an uphill battle, right? You have a lot of what we call performative activism, which is where, we all wear shirts that say Black Lives Matter, but we'll still donate to police unions and, that kind of stuff. But I'm really seeing a lot of change and a lot of shifting in people and places that I never expected to. And I think a large part of that was because of the pandemic, right? Once everyone is sort of literally trapped in their homes, you don't have the same methods for escaping or being able to deny a lot of the coverage that was happening, a lot of things that were being seen. And I think also the pandemic made everyone contemplate their own mortality a little bit more. And so I think that because of all of that, there has been some change there, and that's been really heartening to see in terms of what's been happening then. And even as a high schooler, remembering the conversations I couldn't have with my high school classmates and seeing them then engage with me either individually or on social media and being, leagues away from where they were back in 2015. And part of that is just not being in high school anymore. I think we can all definitely say that. But, part of it too was actually having this time of reflection and engagement, and also this really wonderful and incredible and also exhausting but mobilized pressure from the Black community too.
For me, as someone who's a bit older and who presents in public Black, outside the West Coast, nobody assumes I'm part Asian or anything. On the West Coast, you might be Hawaiian or something, but as someone who presents Black, on the one hand, things are changed because we're able to have these public conversations. On the other hand, little has changed because my life is still forfeit every time I leave the house. I remember in one situation when I was doing a diversity workshop for the United Methodist Church here in LA, and there was a Japanese American who had seen me mostly in Japanese American spaces. And this is the first time she had seen me, and we were at Holman United Methodist Church, so a very Black space. And what I was presenting and what I was working on was more inclusive of different things. And we started to have this conversation. I said to her that I'm never not Black, right? The world doesn't allow me to not be Black. The Japanese American community does not allow me to not be Black. And so, and I would say that still plays out today, though there's much more empathy, there's a worry that they're making me do labor or those sorts of things, right? And there's almost a fear to come talk to me about sort of Black-Japanese relationships, that somehow they would be overburdening me, right? As if I'm not truly a family member, right? So if we're in the family, you have this conversation, right? And if I am sort of worn out, I'll let you know, but don't protect me from being me, right? And so in some ways, on the one hand, there's sort of the what was before was more of the sort of negative connotation, right? But if you flip the other side of the coin, and it's sort of killing me with kindness, but it's still saying you're not one of us, right? And so I think, so in that sense, what's changed is our ability to have these conversations and the willingness to have the conversations. The state of the world for our communities as people of color remains largely the same from structural components. We're making change, and I think that change is coming, and I'm really hopeful about it. I'm really excited about that, right? And yet, right, I still make sure that when I drive, I'm careful. You know, when law enforcement's around, I'm careful. I still have, you know, the one thing that the pandemic has changed is there's not as much everyday interaction, right? So I don't have people going to the other side of the elevator because we don't get in the same elevator together, right? The social distancing, you know, is at one level, is sort of the joke in the Black community is, hey, now you know what our life is like every time we walk out in public in white spaces. People give us that six foot space just in case, right? And so I think in that sense, but the other thing I think too is what I'm hoping will be a change is the recognition that we do have Black Japanese bodies in our community, and we're not over there, but we're part of that family, that we're all part of this family, right? And a recognition of that without regard for some other historical stuff about two communities. But really, Blackness is literally embodied in the Japanese American community.
Yeah, and I think to sort of just touch on this and explain, you know, for folks who maybe aren't as familiar with sort of these conversations that are going on, one of the big pushes in working with sort of particularly Black and Indigenous activists and organizers is recognizing the amount of time and labor and exhaustion that this kind of work takes, right? As you've heard from my dad, and like as I can attest to as well, though, in many different ways, because of gender presentation, because of skin color, because of a lot of things, right? The act of moving through the world as a Black person when that world actively wants you to no longer exist is a lot. It's incredible. It's an incredible burden to bear. And so then when you're mobilizing against that, right, and you're getting, of course, direct opposition, that's also a lot of work, and that's also a lot of time. And so there has been sort of this demand for one, you know, not forcing, right, Black folks to talk about things that they're not comfortable with, to allow us to have, right, space and time away from sort of the politics of activism, though they never really do go away, right, because our existence is inherently political. But sort of recognizing that, oh, like, let's make sure that, you know, this isn't something that we're asking too much of people. But on the flip side of that, you know, the issue has never been that we don't want to talk about these things. The issue has never been that we are tired of talking about being Black, right? Especially for the two of us who are never tired of talking, right? That's never the issue. The issue is more about sort of, right, the choice and control over where our labor is being issued, and also, right, whether that labor is being fairly compensated, because a lot of this work has been asked, you know, of us for free, or really at a negative cost, right? Because one, it is labor and it is tiring, and two, like, that's time we could be spending doing other things. So when we get into this sort of conversation about, right, like, oh, we don't want to burden people, I really encourage folks to think thoughtfully about how we ask people, because either way, I know for both of us too, we ran into the issue this summer, and this was very different than, you know, back in 2015. To bring it all the way back to that question, where people weren't reaching out to us at all. And we were thinking, this is so weird, because we're seeing all these anti-Blackness workshops, we're seeing all these discussions about Black Lives Matter, but there are no Black people in the room. And part of that is sort of recognizing, right, that the Asian American community, there are folks in our community that need to take the steps of doing the work and the education themselves. Like, we don't have to be necessarily in the room for that. That can be sort of internal to folks that, right, don't experience Blackness. But it was super weird to sort of then, reach out to people and say, like, hey, you know, we see that all these workshops are happening. We see all this stuff is happening. What's good, right? Because normally you would ask us, and then they would say, oh, you know, well, we don't want to burden you. We don't want to burden you. We don't want to burden you. So, right, it's always sort of about agency, and it's about choice, and it's about being able to be both, like, have the freedom to sort of talk about what we want to talk about, and being importantly given the platform to talk about things that need to be talked about, but also respecting folks' time, their energy, their labor, and again, right, like, and we'll get into this later, the conversation about reparations and what it means to be compensated for your work.
So for the Day of Remembrance, in 2015, I thought it was important for us to even bring the topic of Black Lives Matter up, right? And we had folks from the community, from the Black Lives Movement, in the panels and those sorts of things. And we were able also to talk about sort of, even in the context of redress and reparations, sort of the importance of the sort of Black Congressional Caucus, right? And Congressman Dellum's impassioned speech, right? That too often gets, I would say, sort of either forgotten or pushed to the side, right, around this narrative of folks like Senator Simpson, who happen to be great friends with Senator Mineta, which I think is fantastic, and that's important. And yet, without the Black Congressional Caucus, reparations doesn't get passed either, right? So both groups, both Simpson working with white conservatives and white progressives, and Dellum's working with the communities of color, allowed for reparations to be passed, redress and reparations. It was integrated. It's the whole story. But too often, I think, in the stories we tell ourselves as Japanese Americans, is that the Dellum's component, the Black Congressional Caucus component, gets left out.
And
right?
Also even recognizing that the word reparations, like the idea of reparations, that discourse, that dialogue, that mobilization started post-slavery, right? That when we invoke reparations, we're invoking a much longer history that's rooted in Black organizing and Black activism here in America, right? The same thing when we talk about citizenship, the same thing when we talk about anything really that has to do with a lot of the mass migration of Japanese Americans in the late 1800s and early 1900s, because right at that point, slavery had just been abolished. And so there are all these conversations about sort of race and migration that are going on at that time. And I know we're definitely just jumping down to the question about reparations and sort of what lessons we can learn from, right, reparations in our community and how that affects the Black community, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
I mean, I would only add to what Mariko just said in terms of even our ability to have citizenship as Japanese immigrants, migrants, comes on the backs of America dealing with its original sin, right, of enslavement. And so the 14th Amendment, which allows for birth citizenship to all persons, right? To all persons, right? So that phrase, all persons, is important because similarly, when Ozawa and others sort of apply for naturalized citizenship, they go back to the 1790 Naturalization Act that said white persons, because Asians were omitted, it must be that they weren't intended. So that notion of all persons, right? So without sort of Black folks, the second generation would not be guaranteed citizenship.
Very true.
Are you following me? So there is no enfranchised and aliens ineligible for citizenship cannot own land. We cannot use that back door and put the land in the names of the children, et cetera. So we would have, Japanese and Asians in general, right, would have been, their sort of settlement here may have been forfeit. And so, it's one of those things where when we understand our history as a community, as a migrant community, right, and the way in which race was constructed and continues to be deconstructed and reconstructed, right? Asians didn't come to a place with blank slates. Japanese didn't come to a place with blank slates, right? It was built around both indigenous and Black bodies, right? And what that meant. And so they came into that. The other part of it, which is interesting sort of historically, is sort of there have been these moments of understanding between Black individuals and Black communities, et cetera. And so you get an awful lot of Black Asian, Black Japanese communities. One of the first families in Sacramento was a Japanese Black family where a Japanese man married an African American woman. But the stories we tell ourselves are often bereft of those stories, right? As a community. So when we get to something like today and DOR and Black Lives Matter, sort of the place that we're at now, it almost seems as if, well, where do we fit in, right? And as the conversation that takes place is, where do we fit in as Japanese Americans? Well, you've been there all along. We have been there all along, right? And so to engage it from this place of, we own this conversation as well, right? Now, we might have to learn and study a little bit for ourselves, but this is our history too.
And I think the most important part of recognizing that is, right, when we center ourselves as a migrant community, it's going to be important for several reasons historically and currently, right? So the first is sort of recognizing that when we stop looking at sort of bound by just like this American sort of what we call a nation state, right? We can recognize that when we're starting to talk about issues of anti-Asian racism and anti-East Asian racism, particularly right in this moment where we've seen a rise of similar sentiments to the sentiments that were happening in the early 1900s and of course right at the beginning of World War II, this idea of Asian bodies as being alien and foreign and inassimilable and threatening, right? That's rooted in our sort of in larger, right, like longer histories of East versus West that are, right, we can talk about for days, but it's also specifically rooted in the fact that there is Japanese migration, Chinese migration here. And, you know, those bodies have been seen as diseased for a long time because they're foreign, right? Like there's an entire quarantine of San Francisco's Chinatown in literally 1900 because of the bubonic plague, and it's only Chinatown, right? And then we see it come through, right, in this through line to World War II, and, right, Japanese Americans, like, right, the reason why we're here today, DOR, and sort of the imprisonment of enemy aliens. And then we see it continue through to COVID-19 and, right, this increase in anti-Asian hate crimes and, again, sort of this rhetoric of, right, a foreign Asian embodied virus. And so why is that all important when we talk about this in conversation with anti-Blackness? And it's because, right, the idea of Asians as being like inherently foreign and inherently inassimilable is also constantly played off of anti-Blackness in a way that makes these histories that we have been talking about, that I think, you know, my dad did a fantastic job of outlining, makes them illegible or makes them hidden, right, in a national narrative. And it's because what we do is we say, okay, well, Asians are foreign and they're not assimilable and they're not, right, part of America. Black people are, but only because we've completely erased their past. Like we've wiped out any sort of, right, adherence to ethnic groups, adherence to knowledge of where we come from for generational African Americans in particular, right, which means folks whose ancestors were enslaved. But we'll also do that to sort of say that, oh, well, you know, this like sort of inherent foreignness is really also going to be a huge part of what brings up the model minority myth, right? That like Asians are really good at math because of like how their languages work and how their school systems work, and this sort of like very foreign group think work ethic that like, you know, will make Asian folks really successful and also align them with whiteness, but also, right, means that they're going to be submissive and they're going to be passive and they're not going to challenge anything or subvert anything, which again, right, history has shown us that's not necessarily true either. And then we can, again, right, play that off of the Black community. Meanwhile, right, we can look at the Black community and say things like, well, you know, it's going to be the opposite of, right, opposite of that. You're going to be loud and sort of, you know, threatening in a violent way and all of these other things. But recognizing that, right, this history of anti-Asian exclusion and migration is inherently part of a history of anti-Blackness, and both of those overlap on top of, right, eradicating the nation of Indigenous people. So all of those things are always, always connected. You can't have one without the other because they're being created to subsume communities at the expense of each other. And that's part of the reason why this history is hidden.
And, you know, and in that regard, right, when I think about sort of my Black heritage, right, I come from my grandfather was a minister. My grandmother was a deaconess. On my grandfather's side, he had sisters who actually started a whole town because they wouldn't educate Black kids where they were. So they moved and bought land and started an entire Black town so that kids could get education. You go back to enslavement. People were learning to read, and if they got caught learning to read, they were beaten and all those sorts of things. So when I hear someone say Black folks don't sort of value education, it makes absolutely no sense. If Black folks didn't want education, didn't want to learn so bad, why did whites create laws to keep them from reading? Why did whites take away funding for their schools once they were supposed to, it's sort of, if we look at 2021 outcomes, right, and understand them only in the context of the last 6 months, the last 2 years, last 5 years, we come to some really erroneous conclusions. And so for those of us in the Japanese American community where education is valued, right, we begin to say, well, we're not like them because, without getting any deeper into the understanding where we probably share a lot more than we don't, right? I wrote a piece for Nikkei, Discover Nikkei, that said, you know, at the core, the two cultures in my household didn't conflict. They actually complemented. Now, the expression of those cultures may have been different, right? From the loud belly laugh, of the Black community to the more polite smiles of the Japanese American community, right? What was underneath, as Clifford Geertz would say, was really the same, right? This understanding of peoplehood and family, the respect of elders, all those, the respect of wisdom and learning.
No,
right?
It's really interesting what both of you are saying, because that does lead into another question about our theme, which is uniting community to keep democracy alive. And both of you mentioned the model minority myth, and it sounds like you're saying that's certainly like a wedge that's used to divide Asian Americans and African Americans and Latinx communities and Native Americans. And so, considering that and relating it to anti-Blackness, and I thought that was very powerful what both of you had mentioned. So at this point, how united do you think the Japanese American community and the African American community are? And what can be done to improve relations? I think you mentioned things about recognizing our commonalities. Mm-hmm. So, Mariko, you want to go first?
Yeah, I think, right, it's a balance, because on the one hand, right, we have this shared history, we have a lot of things in common for sure. And there are a lot of really beautiful instances where I've seen communities come together, where we've seen, Asian folks support Black Lives Matter, and we've seen, Black folks, right, historically and currently supporting communities. I think I have sort of two large thoughts. The first is that we still do need to reckon with the privilege of the Asian American community and what that means, right? We talked about this. My dad talks about, right, this value of education. One really good example that's related to DOR specifically is that, right, a lot of Nisei and mostly Nisei, right, end up serving in World War II because they are drafted in the camps. And after they get drafted, many of them, including my maternal grandfather, who was in the 442nd, get the GI Bill and they go to college. And in my grandfather's case, he became essentially like a nuclear engineer.
Electrical engineer.
One of those things. But right, he becomes an engineer, right? He's able to save up, he's able to be a solidly like middle class person, right? He's able to send his kids to college. He's able to send his grandkids to college, right? Black GIs didn't get that opportunity after World War II. They were not granted access to the GI Bill. They were not granted access to higher education. And so playing that out over the next 2 or 3 generations, right? What does that mean if you're stuck in a working class job, right? Especially as a veteran, what does that mean? And what does that sort of create in terms of options for you and your family going forward? What does that mean for your kids, right? That's a difference, and that's a difference we need to hold and that we need to reckon with. When we talk about reparations, right, that some of the discourse was sort of that Japanese Americans deserved reparations because we were good citizens in comparison to, and that's sort of right implied, other groups of people. That doesn't need to be the case. So being able to sort of recognize and point out that, right, even today, while, again, the pandemic has proven that sort of, especially the physical violence aspect of things has shifted, that the positionality can still be a little bit different. And so what does it mean then to amplify folks whose voices aren't being heard? And what does that mean to draw people in the community who are refusing to reckon with that, and as a result are being inherently oppressive to, right, communities, including our own, but also outside of our own too. And the other thing is, I think, recognizing that there, in terms of being united, what I've seen in terms of, right, dialogue across communities that's been really helpful and that people have started to talk about. I think the conversation around colorism is a really good one to point out, though it is fraught with its own things, mainly in recognizing that like certain types of discrimination when it comes to racism are still sort of common factors in both communities and things that we need to talk about. So colorism being, right, the preference for folks with lighter skins who are more right adjacent to white folks, and not being valued, you know, because of this internalized racism, internalized colonialism, not just in the Black community, but also in the Asian community, like the number of, right, skin whitening products and hair straightening and eye fixing and blah, 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 like all of those kinds of things, until of course, right, the fox eye becomes cool, right? But that there are a lot of interconnected logics, and I do think that in terms of where the conversation has been progressing really helpfully has been in sort of like, hey, you know, we can get together and talk about this and how it impacts both of our communities, what the nuances are there, what does that mean, how do we help each other, how do we understand things as sort of bigger than just our, right, like presumably nuclear communities, and even in that, right, ignores the interconnected history, ignores the interconnected cultures, ignores the interconnected people, right, who are on this call.
You know, I think that when you ask that question about how united are the communities are complex, right? So when I look at something, if I look at the arts community, I think they do much more collaboration. I think they do a better job of collaboration, the creation of art together, the appreciation of each other's art, the borrowing of forms back and forth, right? And I think particularly in sort of poetry and some other things, as we borrow forms, just as spoken word comes out of the oral tradition of the Black community, it's become sort of the way in which younger folks learn to express themselves, and particularly in communities of color. But it also plays into this larger oral tradition in the Japanese culture, right? When we go to vernacular culture, sort of everyday person's culture, storytelling was a vital way in which information, histories, and other things were transmitted, right? Not high culture. I'm talking about everyday people, and let's be frank, at least for the third, fourth, and fifth generations, for the most part, we came in the Japanese community, we came from farm stock, farmers, everyday people telling stories. Now, certainly the post war migration has sort of diversified sort of those sort of class and occupational backgrounds with sort of global corporations, international business, all those sorts of things, and international marriages, military marriages have served to make it messier. But I do think, it's sort of one of the things that I think about as we move forward in these pieces, right? One of the things that we can do as a community is to recognize how COVID and this particular moment, right, has created these even larger structural barriers for those of working class background, those and Black and brown families, right? Access to computers. Glenn, you're a teacher. You know this firsthand, right? What can we do as a community to, with the skills and privileges that we have, the positionality that we have, to be able to say, look, we have brothers and sisters, children in need, and take advantage of that to sort of try to help meet that need, not as saviors, not as these people who are going to swoop in and save the day, but as partners, as family members, to say, there go I by the grace of God. That could have been us. Because if you really examine the history, it truly could have been the Japanese American community, right? So, and in part, so, the work in the 60s to open up industries and neighborhoods and things came from the Black community, and that's where sort of the positionality of placing Asians as the model minority were able to sort of take advantage of those opportunities because, for whatever imagination of white folks, less threatening, et cetera, right? More intellectually capable, whatever their own messed up ideas about who we were as Japanese and other Asian Americans, right? Versus Blacks and Latinos. But we don't have to play into that perpetuation, and we can do something active, right? To engage with that. And so for me, it's really thinking about sort of where I look at the Black community, right? In this time of COVID and all that's coming. If you want to talk about a community that knows, that's resilient, that has embraced democracy, that's resilient, that has overcome, that knows how to struggle and overcome struggle as a whole community, individuals apart, right? Despite being structurally cut out from ultimate sort of success, what if we want to call it that in this world, like upper middle class lifestyle, the Black community has held hope. The Black community has been resilient and resistant, right? We can be the light if only we're brave enough to be it, right? As the poet said, right? She was very clear, right? But Black folks have been doing that, right? That was a Black voice that said it. The one voice that, if you want to be cynical, why would you say it? But says it, right? And challenges us to be more, right? And so I think too often we think about, when you talk about sort of how can we unite, it's like, what do we have to learn from them? Because we're privileged, we got everything to teach them. We can come in and save them. But there's lots for us to learn. So I would love to see our youth in their leadership programs do some programs with something like Community Coalition, which has taught their students in sort of campaign after campaign to bring resources to their community, to get toilets that work in their schools, to get lights that work in their school. Those kids, they train. They don't just show up at a protest because someone says, well, let's go to the protest, we'll have a good time. They train. They know what their talking points are going to be. They know what is being fought after. They're very specific. They work hard at it, right? They won't even let someone go to a protest without having been fully trained, right? That's what community organizing is about, right? So it's not romantic. It's work.
And I think all of that sort of goes to the point of, right, the amplification of existing voices. When we really sort of want to talk about, right, how do the communities become more united? It's not the savior complex. It's not the like, oh, and it's also not the self-flagellation of, oh, we're so privileged, right? It's amplifying existing voices, committing to concrete and like tangible asks that people have been like, it's not like the Black community has been quiet, right? period. And it's also not like the JA community is necessarily that quiet either, right? In terms of having established structures where people can engage with. So it's really just about, doing, if you're going to do the work, right, do the work of going like, what are the programs like Community Coalition in your area? What are they asking for? What do they need? What do they not need? Right. And supporting and amplifying those voices, because we've seen that, right, with both communities, there's an extraordinary amount of, especially political power, as we saw through the last election, that is going to be dependent on coalitions of conjoined like Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. Like that is ultimately, right, what is going to change our democracy for the better and what made the difference in 2016 versus now.
Both Curtis and Mariko, both of you mentioned the word solidarity. Of course, I'm wearing a solidarity shirt, right? Solidarity by any means necessary. And I got this from, and I think it was inspired by Curtis actually, from Senshin. Remember many years ago, I thought that was so empowering after 9/11. The folks over at Senshin wanted to go talk to the folks at the mosque and saying, how you doing? We kind of understand what you're going through because, we've been there. Right. And I still remember going to, I still remember when we had when we first broke bread together for Ramadan. I thought, wow, that was amazing.
But I think I agree with you, and we need to build a consistency, right? Yeah. I think as all of our communities, sort of have had their brushes with different forms of power, and some of it's cultural too, of saying, is this friend for real?
Right.
Are they, in the organizing community, it's like allies are great, but they get to go home at night. Accomplices go to jail with you. Are we going to be allies or accomplices? Right. And I think it's important for us to say, if we're going to be allies or accomplices with another community, as with every relationship, you build that relationship in the good times, you build it in the bad times. It is a relationship. So I look at the work that Nobuko is doing, right? She does it in the arts, right? What is it, beans, frioles, and gohan, right? So that place where they use the arts, right, and do sort of things. But she creates a sort of interesting piece. But she works really hard at creating those relationships, not to sort of hold her up as a lioness that we, but she understands, perhaps because she's in a interracial, intercultural, bicultural family, that, this is work. And it's good, solid, hard work, but it's the right work, right? It's the right work. And so I think in that sense, where can we sort of make those identifications, right? Where can we see our narratives intertwining, right? And where are they specific too? And so that we can then celebrate the specificity. A metaphor I would use at a friend's wedding, there were a Black Japanese wedding, there were taiko and African drummers. Well, each did their little performances, but then during the sort of reception time, drummers being drummers started drumming. And they just went off together, and there's something incredibly magic happened, right? It's a metaphor, because if you spend time with each other and you sort of understand that beat of each other, you can bring your beats together, right? But if you don't spend time together, if we're not in that shared space, you can theorize it, and you can imagine that we're close, but that's a flight of fancy, right? Versus imagination that says, how do we bring creativity to reality?
And the litmus test for that on a day-to-day basis is, right, how many Black friends do you actually have? Just asking yourself that question.
I think one of the questions that we also had in kind of this discussion about work and having to put in work and knowing that it's a sustained work and building relationships is like you're in it for the long run. I was wondering if both of you can kind of address the sustainability of solidarity and how you see it being successful, because since it is work, it is draining at times, and there's so many issues and so many other communities that you can find commonalities with, but obviously you only have X amount of energy, X amount of time. Yes, everybody wants to help everybody, but it's not necessarily always possible. So if you can, I know both of you are involved in a bajillion different organizations and get pulled in a bajillion different ways. But in speaking to partnerships and relationships and how to not make it a performative thing.
I would say that it's sort of, where's your starting place, and so I'm going to sort of play with this a little bit. So, how can we sustain solidarity, right? Was the question you asked, and I'll turn it back on you and saying solidarity should be the outcome of a relationship. How do you sustain relationship? Solidarity then comes as an outcome. Instead of looking at the outcome and says, how do we sustain sustainability, right? Right? Sustainability will happen, right? Sometimes it's like my students, if you just take care of your work and you do your stuff, the other stuff will happen. But if you don't take care of business at the beginning, no matter cramming you do, right, will make that learning something that you own. Well, solidarity won't maintain if it's not built in relationship.
And I think when we talk about relationships and we talk about it at the community level, recognizing, right, I think part of that question, right, has to do with, right, burnout or sort of feeling overwhelmed, feeling like there's not enough. I think, one of the great parts about having more interconnectedness via the internet and social media and things is that, like, you learn a lot more, but it also can be really overwhelming. So I think one, right, recognizing that sort of everyone has their lane and you need to sort of critically interrogate from time to time, right? Am I sort of doing this work correctly? And like, am I sort of, right, making sure that I'm using like best practices and like the approaches that I'm like working with here, and right, am I, thinking about myself, my own positionality, those things, right? And that should be built into the work you do. But also recognizing that, like, the idea that one person can do everything, or the idea that one person should do everything, is this sort of very individualistic model that's rooted in, right, like, exceptionalism and colonialism and racism, and it is not rooted in community care. It's not rooted in recognizing the fact that, like, solidarity is inherently a sustainable resource, right? That community is inherently a sustainable resource because it's not one person doing it alone, or even one group of people doing it alone. When you need to take a step back, there will be other people there to continue the work, right? And to help you and to sort of like back you up. Like, I think it's been a really big and wonderful sort of theme in college for me in particular, and being involved in a number of sort of like student organizing and activism things, is that, if you have a week where your health or personal life or other things, or even just like exams, right, are taking a toll on you, you don't have to go to every single protest. As long as you're consistently putting in the work, right, to have these relationships with people and to be in these spaces and to be in these communities, being able to take time for yourself, then one, you don't feel guilty about it, and two, you recognize that that's necessary in terms of helping everyone, including yourself, in the long run. And I think that's something that I've had to learn. That's been really tough, right? To say no to things, to not feel obligated, because there's always something happening. There's always something going on, but recognizing that, like, it is to everyone's detriment if you try to take everything on. And it at the end of the day, right, it's all about sort of building systems that allow people to be able to take time for themselves, because that too is, right, a form of revolution.
So I'll come back to where I started, right? I'm never not Black. The whole thing with George Floyd, this wasn't our first rodeo in the Black community. It's not going to be our last rodeo. We know we're in this for the long haul, right? We'll be impatient at moments, but we know it's a long haul, right? Relationships are a long haul, right? And we're not always going to get stuff right. We're not always going to get stuff right. And at the beginning, there's going to be lots of questions of why are you here? A lot of suspicion. And so I would say for the Japanese American community, its institutions or individuals, we have to sort of recognize that that's part of the deal, right? That's
and
part
it's
of
funny because like our institutions are some of the most insular ever, right? You know, like you need, if you sort of go to a new temple or like join a new chapter of the JACL or anything like that, right? You know, everyone will be nice to you, but you do have to show up for 7 or 8 years before, right? You know, they're volunteering you for everything, and you know, everyone knows who you are.
Right.
And so recognizing that, like, we have experience in that, we know how to do that, we know how to sit, we know how to absorb, right? Before we sort of get in and start doing the work, and that's absolutely applicable to other communities.
Well, I mean, it's partially in our sort of cultural practice system. Like, you know, I sort of was second in doing the mochi rice steaming for almost 15 years before I was able to step in. And even then, it was a set of unfortunate circumstances that led to me stepping in. But, you know, you apprentice for 20 years. That's just sort of the norm in the Japanese community, right? Japanese American community. So we do have sort of the cultural memory for this, right? I'm a cultural anthropologist, so I sort of think in these ways. We do have that sort of collective cultural memory of how to do it. We just have to transfer that particular set of understandings and experiences to, as we reach across, and to become a part of, to become together, right? That it's this particular moment in history has given us some introductions for us to sort of to meet each other once again, right? And instead of like Watts, when it happened, the Japanese American community ran away from it, ran away from the relationships that they had built from the late 1940s and 1950s and early 1960s, living side by side, going to school with each other, etc. As a community, we ran away from the Black community, right? We get a chance now to be introduced back to the Black community. And so history will tell whether we take advantage of this historical moment to say, yeah, we were wrong when we ran away.
I think that's a really good segue, because I also want to be cognizant of your time. Time just flew by. One of our kind of last questions were, what changes do you hope to see in the future? And I'll just tag on also, traditionally, as I'm sure you're aware, for the Los Angeles DOR, at least, we always have a call to action at the end. And we did ask Maria Perez from the Inland Coalition for Immigrant Justice, who we also spoke to earlier, what their specific call to action was. So if either of you have something specific, please feel free to share that as well.
Oh, wow, this is very full circle for me, because I was the tiny call to action speaker in 2015. Yeah, I mean, I think, right, I've said it before and I'll continue to say it, right, amplification of voices that are more marginalized than yours, and doing that and recognizing the intersectionality of that. So Black voices, the voices of Black women, right, of Black gender non-binary people, of Black queer people, of Black trans people, right? All of those things need to happen. And that is something that you are very capable of doing on an everyday basis, and committing to sort of that kind of help. And remember, you don't have to do everything, but there are a lot of different things you can do, right? And people will have explicit asks, even in spaces that seem performative like social media. You will see, right, these creators, one, there's normally some sort of monetary fund that you can contribute to, but they will ask for specific things about how you interact with their posts and how you engage with them. So I'm talking more, right, towards people who are on Instagram a lot and things like that, right? We know that the algorithm prioritizes saves and comments over likes at this point. So when people ask you to save or interact with a particular post, right, be aware of even those little things that you can do on a daily basis. And then, right, in your everyday life too, just sort of, right, who is not in the room or whose voice isn't being heard, and how can we work on amplifying those voices, because the amplification of those voices will also lead to the amplification of our own in our own community, and trusting that and knowing that, right, that is what solidarity, that's a large part of what solidarity is recognizing that it's not a zero-sum game, right? Things that benefit the Black community will also benefit the Japanese American community. And those things are interconnected, and trusting that even when, right, racism and external pressure will suggest that otherwise is the case.
So for me, I would say individually, learn our histories, whether you do it through literature and reading something like Nino Rivera's novel Southland, that's I think does a really good job, or you read the sort of historical work by Scott Kurashige that really talks about, since I'm going to sort of be Los Angeles based at the moment. That's the work that we can do ourselves. I mean, as individuals. As institutions and companies or even entrepreneurs, interrogate sort of, who do we buy from? Who do we have partnerships from? You know, where do we have our bank accounts? And I know there's a lot of sort of, we do a lot of, and our family does too, sort of support the sort of business interest, entrepreneurial interest of Little Tokyo, Japanese American insurance folks, you know, all those sorts of things, right? Sort of individual business and stuff. But there are also Black merchants out there that you can shop from, right? There are also times when you can do your catering from, you know, it's all right to do something multicultural once in a while and have food from some other place, but sort of interrogate whether or not your default is mainstream, right? I need to buy paper for our organizations, you know, sort of, do I buy it from Staples, or do I help a small business, whether it's Japanese American or other folks of color, Black communities? So, I mean, so there's that piece of it, right? When we think about where we recruit for jobs, for people with jobs and the like, right? You know, I've been working with a group to say, look, if you need engineers, the National Association of Black Engineers can hook you up with folks who are really talented. If we look at the history of Black engineering in the United States, they've done some pretty amazing things, right? So you know, sort of that piece of saying, each of us in our own spheres of influence can make some active decisions to do something differently. You know, so I teach at LMU, which is Jesuit, when I talked about imagination and sort of the Jesuit notion, when creativity meets reality. The reality is there's not equity. How can we bring our creative minds to bringing that equity, to bringing that relationship that creates that solidarity that we all in this Zoom call crave so badly for ourselves and our communities, right? You know, and so it's being intentional, and not even being afraid to look closely in a mirror to say, why am I doing what I'm doing? Or are there other things I could do differently that would help even at the margins?
I love the interrogate your default. I think that's a really succinct way to think about things. Easy.
I actually had more questions, but it has been an hour right now. And thank you so much for both of you coming. Andie, did you have any more questions?
I sort of hit the questions that you had in our other answers, but yeah.
Yeah, like you did touch on some other things that I did want to ask you about reparations. Would you like to talk about that a little, or you touched on it before about like the Japanese American redress movement. But I do know that there's been that bill that was introduced by John Conyers back in '89, and it's been introduced many other times since then. It seems like it's finally starting to get a little bit of traction. But you know, what can Japanese Americans, what do you think Japanese Americans can do to support this effort.
Get on the phone and call your congressperson.
And
Call your
also
senators.
that reparations does not just have to be through the lens of our government, right? Reparations can look like thoughtful and sustainable shopping, right? It can look like actively committing to supporting 2 or 3 Black creators a month. Like, again, the people are out there who are saying, right, hey, I need help with rent. Hey, I'm transgender and I need help with transition surgery, right? All of those, there are many a GoFundMe that you can donate to. There are many a Venmo that you can Venmo. And setting up a sustainable, when we talk about sustainability, just set up a monthly plan, right? I'm committing this much to these causes, even if they're not tax deductible, and that's okay.
Right. So I think there's the political action that takes place, the personal action that takes place, then the sort of community institutional actions that take place, right? Can we even do scholarships with the school that's adjacent to where our temple or community center is, right? And whatever that population happens to be. And I really think that, again, going back, what are our defaults?
Right.
Right. And if it's about sort of creating more, what's the more we wish to create? Right. And in doing so, that's where, if you have relationship, the communities that we're working with will tell us how we can be helpful. Mm-hmm. Right? If you have a relationship. If you don't have a relationship, then you come in and you say, well, I'll do this for you. And sometimes they'll say yes, sometimes they'll say no, but if you have a relationship, then it becomes this organic understanding of sort of how a need can be met, how that reparations at the sort of individual institutional level can be met. How can we together as communities push for the political shift that needs to be done? And what does that comprise, right? And so in that sense, I think there's a lot that we can do. But I also think we have to deal with, within our community, some people saying that Black folks don't deserve it. Right. I mean, that's maybe a small elephant in the room, but that's where we have to sort of interrogate our own thoughts about it, right? And in publications that we write, things that we do, and elevate that understanding and have that conversation.
Well, I think it's very true, and I remember, when I was involved back in the redress movement, I mean, that was one of the concerns in Congress, is that if you give Japanese Americans the apology and reparations, well, everyone else is going to want it too. And so they tried to make it as narrow as possible, to say, well, this was a violation of constitutional rights. And to hopefully disqualify other groups from actually getting it. And of course, with NCRR, I mean, that was never our position personally, but it's something that, yeah, of course, what you just mentioned, I mean, that is a part of it.
And I think even within that, sort of turn it back on it as saying, darn Skippy, enslavement was a constitutional right, right? That was the evil that was there.
Yeah, there you go.
Right. So we have to call our system out on that which was evil.
Yeah.
Right. So, and though it got rectified, right? And I think there's some more immediate things that we have to work on with reparations to make sure the voting access is going to be challenged greatly in the next 2 years by legislatures and other areas around the United States, right? That it's imperative that we get a new Voting Rights Act passed, period, right? If our democracy is going to hold. But those are the stakes that I think we as a community have to recognize. I was going to be softer about it, be more Japanesey, but we have to recognize it, right? That's the stakes. Because we know what happens when democracy is taken away. A segment of our community experienced that.
Yes.
Right? So, yeah.